The morning sun cast long shadows across the USS Enterprise as Captain James Mitchell stood on the bridge, watching his crew prepare for what should have been a routine training exercise. The massive aircraft carrier cut through the Pacific waters with the confidence that only comes from decades of naval superiority. At over 1,000 feet long and carrying more than 5,000 souls, the Enterprise was a floating city of steel and determination. Captain Mitchell had been commanding naval vessels for 15 years, but the Enterprise was his first aircraft carrier assignment. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders as he observed the controlled chaos of flight deck operations. Bay 18 Super Hornets were being positioned for takeoff, their engines creating a symphony of power that resonated through the ship's hull. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, the ship's senior engineering officer, approached the captain with her daily report. Her face showed the kind of confidence that comes from knowing every bolt and wire in the ship's complex systems. "All systems green across the board, Captain," she reported crisply. "Engineering reports full power available from all 4 reactors. We're running at optimal efficiency." The captain nodded, but something nagged at him. In his years at sea, he had learned to trust his instincts, and today something felt different. The ship's vibrations seemed slightly off, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. He dismissed the feeling as pre-exercise nerves and focused on the mission ahead. Down in the engine room, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rodriguez was conducting his routine inspection of the primary propulsion systems. The massive turbines hummed with their usual rhythm, but Rodriguez noticed a slight irregularity in one of the monitoring displays. The readings were still within acceptable parameters, but his trained eye caught the subtle deviation that others might miss. Rodriguez had been working on aircraft carrier engines for 8 years, ever since he joined the Navy straight out of high school in Texas. His father had served on destroyers during the Gulf War, and the family tradition of naval service ran deep. He prided himself on knowing the Enterprise's engines better than anyone else on board. As he made his rounds, Rodriguez documented the anomaly in his log, but didn't immediately report it. The readings were borderline, and he wanted to monitor them for another hour before raising any alarms. In the Navy, false alarms could damage a sailor's reputation, and Rodriguez had worked too hard to build his credibility to risk it on a minor fluctuation. Meanwhile, on the flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh was overseeing the preparation of her squadron's aircraft. The roar of jet engines mixed with the shouts of deck crew as they went through their choreographed dance of moving multi-million-dollar fighter jets into position. Walsh had flown combat missions over 3 different theaters of operation, and she knew the importance of having a reliable platform beneath her feet. The Enterprise was scheduled to conduct advanced fighter training exercises with Allied forces from Japan and Australia. The operation would demonstrate American naval power in the Pacific while strengthening international partnerships. For the crew, it was an opportunity to prove their skills and maintain their edge in an increasingly complex global environment. In the ship's Combat Information Center, radar operators tracked friendly aircraft approaching from the west. The Allied forces were right on schedule, and their professional communications filled the radio channels with routine coordination chatter. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, which should have been reassuring but somehow made Captain Mitchell even more uneasy. The ship's executive officer, Commander Robert Hayes, joined the captain on the bridge with a steaming cup of coffee and the latest weather report. "Seas are calm, visibility is excellent, and we have perfect flying conditions," Hayes reported. "The Japanese pilots are already expressing their excitement about working with our air crews again." Captain Mitchell accepted the coffee gratefully and tried to shake off his uneasiness. Perhaps it was simply the magnitude of the operation that was affecting him. Coordinating exercises with international partners always carried additional pressure, as any problems would be magnified in the eyes of allies and superiors alike. As the morning progressed, the Enterprise's crew went about their duties with the efficiency that comes from months of training and preparation. In the galley, cooks prepared meals for thousands of hungry sailors. In the medical bay, corpsmen checked their equipment and supplies. Throughout the ship, hundreds of men and women performed the countless tasks necessary to keep a floating city operational. The ship's air traffic control center buzzed with activity as controllers coordinated the complex dance of aircraft operations. Launch schedules were verified, recovery times were calculated, and safety protocols were reviewed one final time. The margin for error in carrier aviation was measured in seconds and inches, leaving no room for complacency. Below decks, the engineering spaces hummed with the constant activity of maintaining the ship's complex systems. The Enterprise was powered by 8 nuclear reactors that provided virtually unlimited range and endurance. The engineering crew took pride in their ability to keep the massive ship moving at speeds that would surprise most civilian observers. As noon approached, Captain Mitchell gave the order to commence flight operations. The ship's horn sounded 3 times, signaling the beginning of active flight deck operations. Within minutes, the first fighter jet was catapulted into the sky, beginning what everyone expected to be a routine but impressive display of naval aviation prowess. The Allied aircraft were now visible on the horizon, approaching in perfect formation. Radio communications confirmed their readiness to begin the coordinated exercises that had been planned for months. The stage was set for a successful demonstration of international cooperation and military precision. However, down in the engine room, Petty Officer Rodriguez was becoming increasingly concerned about the readings he had been monitoring. The subtle anomaly he had noticed earlier was beginning to show a definite trend, and the numbers were slowly but steadily moving outside of normal operating parameters. He knew it was time to report his observations to the engineering officer, regardless of the potential embarrassment if his concerns proved unfounded. As Rodriguez reached for his communication device to make the report that would change everything, the Enterprise continued its course through the Pacific waters, carrying its crew toward an encounter that none of them could have imagined. The routine training exercise was about to become something much more significant, and the skills and dedication of every person aboard would soon be tested in ways they had never anticipated. Petty Officer Rodriguez's call to Chief Chen came just as the first wave of Allied aircraft began their approach to the Enterprise. His voice carried the tension of someone who knew he was about to deliver unwelcome news. "Chief, we've got a developing situation down here in engineering. Those readings I've been watching are definitely trending outside normal parameters." Chief Chen felt her stomach tighten as she reviewed Rodriguez's data on her handheld device. The numbers told a story that no one wanted to hear during active flight operations with international partners watching. "Rodriguez, I need you to run a complete diagnostic on all monitoring systems immediately. Are you certain these readings are accurate?" The urgency in Chen's voice was not lost on Rodriguez, who had already begun the diagnostic procedures. "Chief, I've triple-checked everything. The instruments are functioning normally. We're looking at a real degradation in the primary propulsion system. It's subtle, but it's definitely there and getting worse." On the bridge, Captain Mitchell was watching the approaching Allied aircraft when Commander Hayes received the call from engineering. The executive officer's face went pale as he listened to Chief Chen's report. The timing could not have been worse, with dozens of aircraft in the air and complex international operations underway. "Captain, we need to speak privately," Hayes said quietly, gesturing toward the chart room behind the bridge. Mitchell followed, his earlier uneasiness now crystallizing into something more concrete and troubling. Chief Chen's voice was steady but serious as she briefed the senior officers over the secure communication system. "Sir, we're experiencing what appears to be a developing failure in one of our primary propulsion turbines. The degradation is slow but consistent. If the trend continues, we could be looking at a complete loss of propulsion within the next few hours." Captain Mitchell felt the weight of command settle even more heavily on his shoulders. Losing propulsion during flight operations was every carrier captain's nightmare. Without the ability to generate wind over the deck, aircraft recovery would become extremely dangerous, if not impossible. "Chief, what are our options? Can we maintain current operations while you investigate?" "Sir, I recommend we begin preparing for emergency procedures while we attempt to identify and correct the problem. We can continue current operations for now, but we need to be ready to modify our plans quickly if the situation deteriorates." The captain made the difficult decision to continue the exercise while quietly preparing for potential emergency procedures. The Allied aircraft had already committed to their approach patterns, and aborting the operation without clear and immediate danger would create diplomatic complications that could last for years. Meanwhile, down in the engineering spaces, Rodriguez and his team were working frantically to isolate the source of the problem. The massive turbine systems that drove the Enterprise through the water were marvels of engineering, but their complexity made troubleshooting a challenging process. Every minute that passed brought them closer to a potential crisis. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, still unaware of the developing situation below decks, was coordinating the complex aerial ballet as Allied aircraft began their demonstration flights around the carrier. The Japanese pilots were executing flawless maneuvers, their F-2 fighters dancing through the sky with precision that spoke to years of training and natural skill. The Australian contingent followed with their own impressive display, their FA-18 Hornets performing formations that showcased both individual pilot skills and unit cohesion. The international cooperation was proceeding exactly as planned, making the developing crisis below decks even more frustrating for the American crew. In the ship's communications center, radio operators were managing multiple frequencies simultaneously, coordinating not only with the Allied aircraft, but also with other naval vessels in the area. The exercise involved ships from 3 different navies, and the complexity of the operation required constant attention to detail and protocol. Chief Chen had assembled her best engineers in the main engineering space, where banks of monitors displayed real-time data from every critical system on the ship. The troubleshooting process was methodical but time-consuming, as they worked to isolate which specific component was causing the degradation in performance. "The problem appears to be in the number 2 turbine assembly," reported Petty Officer 2nd Class Jennifer Park, one of Chen's most experienced technicians. "We're seeing bearing temperatures that are elevated but not yet critical. If they continue to rise, we'll have no choice but to shut down that entire propulsion unit." Chen nodded grimly as she considered the implications. The Enterprise had multiple propulsion systems for exactly this type of emergency, but losing one turbine would significantly reduce their speed and maneuverability. More importantly, it would affect their ability to generate sufficient wind speed over the flight deck for safe aircraft operations. On the flight deck, the coordinated exercise was reaching its crescendo as American, Japanese, and Australian aircraft performed a complex formation flight around the carrier. The sight was magnificent, representing the best of international military cooperation and the skill of naval aviators from 3 different nations. Captain Mitchell watched from the bridge, torn between pride in what his crew and their allies were accomplishing, and growing concern about the situation developing below decks. Every few minutes he received updates from Chief Chen, and each report brought increasingly serious news about the propulsion system. The irony was not lost on him that while they were demonstrating the Enterprise's power and capability to their allies, the ship itself was slowly losing the very systems that made such demonstrations possible. The timing seemed almost deliberately cruel, as if the ocean itself was testing their resolve and professionalism. In the Combat Information Center, radar operators continued tracking all aircraft while maintaining communication with other ships in the exercise area. The professional competence of the crew was evident in how smoothly the complex operation was proceeding, despite the growing crisis that most of them didn't even know existed. Commander Hayes found himself in the difficult position of maintaining normal operations while quietly preparing for potential emergency procedures. He discreetly ordered department heads to review their emergency protocols without explaining why. Hoping to avoid panic while ensuring readiness, the Allied aircraft were now beginning their planned recovery operations, with the Japanese fighters scheduled to land first. Lieutenant Commander Walsh and her air traffic controllers were managing the complex sequence of events that would bring dozens of high-performance aircraft safely back to their respective ships as the first Japanese F-2 approached the Enterprise for a touch-and-go demonstration. Chief Chen's voice came over the bridge communication system with news that everyone had been dreading. "Captain, we've just lost primary lubrication pressure in the number 2 turbine. We need to shut it down immediately or risk catastrophic failure." The timing could not have been worse, with Allied aircraft in critical phases of their approach patterns and international prestige on the line. Captain Mitchell faced a decision that would test every aspect of his leadership training and experience. The safety of his crew and the Allied pilots had to come first, but the diplomatic and military implications of his next orders would resonate far beyond this single day in the Pacific. The Enterprise shuddered almost imperceptibly as Chief Chen executed the emergency shutdown of the number 2 turbine. The vibration that followed was subtle but noticeable to anyone familiar with the ship's normal operations. Captain Mitchell gripped the bridge railing as he felt the change in his ship's rhythm, knowing that they had just crossed a line from routine operations into crisis management. "All stations, this is the bridge," Mitchell announced over the ship's internal communication system, his voice carefully controlled to avoid causing panic. "We are experiencing a minor engineering issue that requires us to modify our current operations. All department heads report to your emergency stations and await further instructions." The Japanese pilot, approaching for his touch-and-go demonstration, was unaware of the drama unfolding below as he lined up perfectly with the carrier's deck. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, now briefed on the situation, was faced with the challenge of maintaining normal air traffic control operations while preparing for potentially dramatic changes in the ship's capabilities. Down in engineering, the shutdown of the No. 2 turbine had revealed the full extent of the problem. Chief Chen's worst fears were confirmed as diagnostic systems showed that the bearing failure was more severe than initially suspected. The damaged components had scattered metal particles throughout the lubrication system, potentially affecting other turbines as well. "Captain, we've got a bigger problem than we initially thought," Chen reported from the engineering space, her voice tight with controlled stress. "The bearing failure has contaminated our lubricating oil system. We're going to need to shut down additional turbines for inspection and cleaning before we risk damage to the entire propulsion plant." Rodriguez and his team were working frantically to assess the extent of the contamination, running tests on oil samples and checking filter systems throughout the ship. The complexity of the Enterprise's propulsion system, normally a source of pride and capability, had become a liability as they tried to determine how far the damage had spread. The Japanese pilot completed his touch-and-go demonstration flawlessly, but as he pulled away from the deck, the Enterprise's reduced speed was becoming noticeable to experienced naval aviators. The ship's wake pattern had changed subtly, and the wind speed over the deck was beginning to decrease below optimal levels for safe aircraft operations. "Captain," Mitchell made the difficult decision to inform the Allied commanders of their situation before it became obvious to everyone involved. "Sakura Lead, this is Enterprise Actual," he transmitted to the Japanese flight leader. "We are experiencing minor engineering difficulties that may require us to modify our planned operations. Please stand by for further instructions." The response from the Japanese commander was immediate and professional. "Enterprise Actual, Sakura Lead copies. We are prepared to adjust our operations as needed. Please advise your requirements." The calm professionalism in the pilot's voice was reassuring, but Mitchell knew that the diplomatic implications of their situation were growing more serious by the minute. Commander Hayes was coordinating with department heads throughout the ship, ensuring that emergency procedures were being implemented smoothly while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. The crew's training was evident in how quickly they adapted to the changing situation, but the stress was beginning to show in the faces of senior petty officers who understood the seriousness of their predicament. In the ship's damage control center, teams were reviewing emergency procedures for total propulsion loss while hoping they wouldn't need to implement them. The Enterprise carried emergency backup systems, but none of them could provide the speed and maneuverability necessary for normal flight operations. Chief Chen faced an impossible decision as additional oil contamination was discovered in the No. 3 turbine system. Shutting down another turbine would reduce the ship's speed to the point where aircraft recovery would become extremely dangerous. Leaving it running risked catastrophic failure that could leave them completely dead in the water. "Captain, I need to shut down No. 3 as well," Chen reported, her voice heavy with the implications of her recommendation. "The contamination is worse than we thought, and if we lose this turbine to catastrophic failure, we'll have metal debris throughout the entire system." The Allied aircraft were now in a holding pattern, waiting for instructions while their fuel supply steadily decreased. The Australian pilots had joined the Japanese in professional standby mode, but Mitchell knew that their patience would not last indefinitely. More importantly, the safety margins for aircraft recovery were rapidly shrinking. As the Enterprise's speed dropped below 20 knots, the wind over the deck decreased to levels that made normal aircraft operations impossible. The flight deck crew could be seen checking and rechecking their equipment, preparing for emergency recovery, procedures that everyone hoped they wouldn't need to use. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was now faced with directing Allied aircraft to alternative recovery options while maintaining the fiction that the Enterprise's problems were minor and temporary. Her air traffic control team was performing magnificently under pressure, but the strain was evident in their increasingly terse radio communications. The ship's medical team was quietly preparing for potential casualties, hoping for the best while preparing for scenarios that no one wanted to contemplate. The complexity of aircraft carrier operations meant that problems could cascade quickly from engineering issues to life-threatening emergencies. In the engineering spaces, Rodriguez made a discovery that changed everything. While checking the oil filtration systems, he found evidence that the bearing failure might not have been a random mechanical problem. The wear patterns on the damaged components suggested that the lubrication system had been compromised for some time, possibly due to contaminated oil supplies taken on during their last port visit. "Chief, you need to see this," Rodriguez called out, holding up an oil filter that was clogged with metallic particles and what appeared to be foreign contaminants. "This isn't normal wear. Something got into our oil supply, and it's been eating away at our bearings for weeks." The implications of Rodriguez's discovery were staggering. If contaminated oil had been circulating through all of the ship's propulsion systems, they might be facing multiple turbine failures in rapid succession. The Enterprise could be looking at complete propulsion loss within hours, leaving them dead in the water with dozens of aircraft in the air and limited fuel. Chief Chen stared at the contaminated filter, her mind racing through the implications and possible solutions. 20 years of naval engineering experience had prepared her for many emergencies, but the scale of this potential disaster was beyond anything she had encountered. The Enterprise and its crew were facing a crisis that would test every aspect of their training, courage, and ingenuity. Captain Mitchell received Chen's latest report with growing alarm, realizing that their situation had just transformed from a manageable engineering problem into a potential catastrophe. With Allied aircraft in the air and international observers watching, the Enterprise was facing the ultimate test of its crew's capabilities and the ship's design resilience. The stage was set for a drama that would unfold over the next several hours, with the lives of thousands of people hanging in the balance and the reputation of the United States Navy at stake. What had begun as a routine training exercise was becoming a test of everything the Enterprise and its crew represented. The Enterprise was now limping through the Pacific at barely 12 knots, with 3 of its 4 primary turbines shut down due to oil contamination. The massive carrier that had been a symbol of American naval power just hours earlier was now struggling to maintain enough speed to keep steerage way. Captain Mitchell stood on the bridge, watching his ship's wake grow smaller and more turbulent as their forward momentum continued to decrease. Chief Chen's engineering teams were working around the clock to flush the contaminated oil from the ship's systems, but the process was painstakingly slow. Every line had to be cleaned, every filter replaced, and every bearing inspected before they could even attempt to restart the damaged turbines. The work required precision and patience, 2 commodities that were in short supply given their deteriorating situation. The Allied aircraft had been diverted to other carriers in the exercise area, but not before several tense moments as fuel supplies ran low and recovery options became limited. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had managed the crisis with remarkable skill, coordinating with multiple ships and air traffic control centers to ensure that every pilot reached safety. The professionalism displayed under pressure had impressed even the experienced Japanese and Australian commanders. However, the Enterprise's problems were far from over. The contaminated oil had affected more than just the propulsion turbines. Auxiliary systems throughout the ship were beginning to show signs of distress as the contamination spread through interconnected lubrication circuits. The ship's massive generators, which provided electrical power for everything from radar systems to galley equipment, were starting to experience fluctuations that threatened critical operations. Petty Officer Rodriguez had become the ship's unofficial expert on the contamination crisis, having been the first to identify the problem and trace its source. His investigation had revealed that the contaminated oil had likely been loaded during their last port visit in San Diego, possibly as a result of sabotage or criminal negligence by a civilian contractor. The implications were serious enough to involve naval intelligence investigators, but that was a problem for another day. The immediate challenge was keeping the Enterprise operational with minimal propulsion and increasing electrical problems. The ship's nuclear reactors continued to function normally, providing steam for the remaining operational turbine. but the reduction in power generation was forcing difficult decisions about which systems to prioritize. Commander Hayes had implemented emergency power conservation measures throughout the ship, shutting down non-essential systems and reducing lighting in many compartments. The crew adapted to the changes with typical naval flexibility, but the atmosphere aboard the ship had definitely changed from confidence to concern. In the ship's communications center, radio operators were maintaining contact with the task force commander and Pentagon officials who were following the developing crisis with growing alarm. The Enterprise was not just any aircraft carrier. It was a symbol of American military capability, and its current predicament was being watched at the highest levels of government. Captain Mitchell found himself in the unprecedented position of commanding a crippled aircraft carrier with limited options for assistance. Other ships in the task force could provide some support, but none had the specialized equipment needed to repair the Enterprise's propulsion systems at sea. The nearest port with adequate facilities was over 1,000 miles away, and at their current speed, reaching safety would take days rather than hours. The weather forecast was adding another layer of complexity to their situation. A major storm system was developing to the west, with winds and seas that could prove dangerous to a ship with limited maneuverability. The Enterprise's massive size normally made it relatively immune to rough weather, but without adequate propulsion, even a large carrier could find itself in serious trouble. Chief Chen had made the difficult decision to attempt restarting one of the contaminated turbines after completing emergency cleaning procedures. The risk was enormous. If the turbine failed catastrophically, it could damage other systems and leave them in an even worse position. However, their current situation was deteriorating so rapidly that calculated risks were becoming necessary. The crew assembled in the engineering spaces was a mixture of experienced petty officers and young sailors, all of whom understood the gravity of their situation. The restart procedure would require precise coordination and constant monitoring of dozens of different systems. One mistake could turn a manageable crisis into a complete disaster. Rodriguez was positioned at the primary monitoring station, watching readouts that would tell them within seconds whether their gamble was paying off. His hands were steady despite the stress, and his eyes never left the displays that showed bearing temperatures, oil pressure, and vibration levels. The entire ship seemed to hold its breath as Chen gave the order to begin the restart sequence. The turbine came online slowly, its massive rotors gradually building up speed as steam pressure increased. For the first few minutes, everything appeared normal, with temperatures and pressures remaining within acceptable ranges. The Enterprise began to pick up speed almost immediately, and the improved forward motion was noticeable throughout the ship. However, their relief was short-lived. After 20 minutes of apparently normal operation, Rodriguez noticed the telltale signs of bearing distress returning. The contamination had not been completely eliminated, and the turbine was beginning to show the same symptoms that had started their crisis. They had bought themselves time, but at the cost of potentially making their long-term situation worse. Captain Mitchell faced another impossible decision as Chief Chen reported the developing problems with the restarted turbine. They could shut it down again and accept their current limitations, or they could continue running it and hope to reach assistance before it failed completely. Either choice carried enormous risks, and the consequences of a wrong decision could be catastrophic. The storm system was approaching faster than originally predicted, with weather reports indicating that they had perhaps 6 hours before conditions became too dangerous for effective damage control work. The Enterprise needed to reach calmer waters or complete its repairs before the weather deteriorated beyond manageable levels. In the ship's wardroom, senior officers were reviewing emergency procedures and contingency plans that they had hoped never to implement. The scenarios being discussed ranged from controlled abandonment of the ship to emergency towing operations by other naval vessels. None of the options were attractive, and all of them carried significant risks to the crew and the ship. The crew's morale remained surprisingly good despite their dangerous situation. Naval training had prepared them for emergencies, and the professionalism of their officers was helping to maintain confidence even in the face of mounting problems. However, everyone aboard understood that they were facing the most serious crisis in the Enterprise's operational history. As evening approached, the Enterprise continued its slow progress through increasingly rough seas, with one turbine running on borrowed time and critical systems throughout the ship showing signs of stress. The next few hours would determine whether the crew could overcome their, mounting problems or whether they would face an emergency that would test every aspect of their training and courage. The stage was set for a night that none of them would ever forget, as the Enterprise and its crew faced challenges that would require everything they had learned about seamanship, engineering, and survival at sea. The storm hit the Enterprise just after midnight, with winds gusting to 40 knots and seas building to 15 feet. The massive carrier, normally stable enough to conduct flight operations in moderate weather, was now rolling heavily due to its reduced speed and compromised maneuverability. Captain Mitchell had been on the bridge for 18 straight hours, refusing to leave his post as his ship fought for survival against both mechanical failure and the fury of the Pacific Ocean. The single operating turbine was showing increasing signs of distress, with bearing temperatures rising steadily despite Chief Chen's best efforts to manage the contamination. Rodriguez had not left the engineering space for 12 hours, monitoring the critical systems that kept them moving forward at a painfully slow 8 knots. The mathematics of their situation were becoming increasingly grim. At their current speed, they would not reach port before the turbine failed. Completely, Commander Hayes was coordinating damage control efforts throughout the ship as the heavy seas began to take their toll on equipment already stressed by the propulsion crisis. Electrical systems were experiencing intermittent failures, and several compartments were reporting minor flooding as the ship's reduced speed made it less able to rise with the waves rather than plow through them. In the communications center, radio operators were maintaining constant contact with rescue vessels that were approaching from 3 different directions. The Navy had dispatched 2 tugboats and a repair ship from San Diego, but even at maximum speed they were still more than 20 hours away. The Coast Guard had diverted a heavy icebreaker from Alaska, but it would take even longer to reach the Enterprise's position. The crew was fighting fatigue as well as mechanical failure, with many sailors having been at their emergency stations for more than a day. Captain Mitchell had authorized emergency rest periods for non-essential personnel, but the engineering and navigation teams continued working around the clock. Coffee and determination were sustaining them, but both commodities were finite. Chief Chen made the agonizing decision to shut down the failing turbine before it could suffer catastrophic failure and damage other systems. The Enterprise shuddered as the last of its main propulsion went offline, leaving the massive ship at the mercy of wind and current. Emergency steering systems kept them pointed into the waves, but they were essentially drifting rather than making any meaningful progress toward safety. The storm was intensifying rather than moving through their area as originally forecast, with meteorologists now predicting that dangerous conditions would persist for at least another 12 hours. The Enterprise was trapped in a circle of problems, too far from help to expect rapid assistance, too damaged to help itself, and facing weather that made outside assistance extremely difficult to provide. Captain Mitchell found himself in the unprecedented position of commanding a dead ship that was still very much alive with 5,000 souls depending on his leadership. The nuclear reactors continued to provide electrical power and steam for essential systems, but without propulsion, the Enterprise was essentially a floating island with limited ability to control its destiny. As dawn approached, the storm began to show signs of moderating, but the Enterprise's problems were far from over. The ship had drifted nearly 50 miles off course during the night, and the reduced electrical power was beginning to affect critical navigation and communication systems. The crew was exhausted, the ship was damaged, and help was still many hours away. It was then that Petty Officer Rodriguez noticed something unusual on the flight deck. Despite orders that all non-essential personnel should remain below decks during the storm, someone was moving around the aircraft parking area. Security cameras showed an elderly man in civilian clothes, apparently inspecting the aircraft and deck equipment with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Rodriguez reported the sighting to the bridge, where Commander Hayes immediately dispatched a security team to investigate. The presence of an unauthorized civilian on the flight deck during a storm was a serious security breach, and they needed to identify the individual and get him to safety immediately. The security team found the elderly man near one of the parked FA-18 fighters, but instead of appearing lost or confused, he seemed to be conducting a systematic inspection of the aircraft's engine systems. When confronted, he identified himself calmly and presented credentials that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. "I'm retired Admiral William Thompson," the man said with quiet authority. "I commanded this ship during the Gulf War, and I think I might be able to help with your current difficulties." The security team leader, a seasoned petty officer who recognized the name from naval history, immediately escorted the admiral to the bridge, while radioing ahead to verify his identity. Captain Mitchell could hardly believe what he was hearing as Commander Hayes reported the admiral's presence on the ship. Admiral Thompson was a legend in naval circles, known for his innovative engineering solutions and his ability to handle crisis situations with calm competence. However, no one could explain how he had gotten aboard the Enterprise or why he was there. The mystery deepened when Admiral Thompson appeared on the bridge, dry and composed despite the storm raging outside. His presence was commanding despite his civilian clothes and advanced age, and he spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Captain, I've been monitoring your situation through official channels," Admiral Thompson explained, his voice carrying the confidence of decades of naval experience. "I was aboard one of the support vessels that was approaching your position when I decided that I might be more useful here than there. I have some experience with the Enterprise's systems that might prove valuable." Mitchell was skeptical but desperate enough to listen to any suggestions that might help his ship and crew. Admiral Thompson's reputation was impeccable, but his sudden appearance under impossible circumstances was difficult to explain or understand. However, with his ship dead in the water and thousands of lives at stake, the captain was willing to accept help from any source. "What do you propose, Admiral?" Mitchell asked, his fatigue evident in his voice, but his attention focused entirely on this unexpected development. The storm was beginning to moderate, but they were still facing a crisis that conventional solutions had failed to resolve. Admiral Thompson smiled with the confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges before. "Captain, I believe your people have been approaching this problem from the wrong direction. Instead of trying to repair your main propulsion, we need to think about alternatives that your crew might not have considered. The Enterprise has capabilities that go far beyond its primary systems." The bridge fell, silent as everyone present realized that they might be witnessing the beginning of a solution to their seemingly impossible situation. Admiral Thompson's presence was mysterious, but his confidence was infectious, and for the first time in many hours, Captain Mitchell felt a spark of hope that they might yet save their ship and crew. Admiral Thompson moved through the Enterprise with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the massive ship. His presence was both comforting and puzzling to the crew, who watched in amazement as the legendary officer seemed to materialize wherever he was needed most. Captain Mitchell had assigned Commander Hayes to accompany the Admiral, but Thompson seemed to know the ship's layout better than officers who had served aboard her for years. "The solution to your propulsion problem isn't in the main engineering spaces," Admiral Thompson explained as he led a small group toward a section of the ship that few current crew members had ever visited. "During my command, we developed alternative systems that were classified at the time but might be exactly what you need now." Chief Chen was skeptical but intrigued as Thompson guided them through passages that led to auxiliary machinery spaces deep in the ship's hull. The areas they were entering had been sealed for years, containing backup systems that were rarely used and poorly understood by the current crew. Thompson moved through the maze of passages with the certainty of someone following a familiar path. "Here," Thompson said, stopping before a heavy watertight door marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. "Behind this door are the Enterprise's emergency propulsion systems. They were installed during her last major overhaul, but were never fully tested due to budget constraints and changing priorities." The door opened to reveal a compartment filled with equipment that looked both familiar and strange to the experienced engineers. The systems were clearly propulsion-related, but their configuration was unlike anything in the standard technical manuals. Thompson began explaining the setup with the enthusiasm of an inventor showing off his life's work. "These are hybrid electric drive motors powered directly by the ship's nuclear reactors," Thompson continued, his hands moving confidently over control panels that had been dormant for years. "They were designed as a backup system for exactly the kind of crisis you're facing now. The power output is limited compared to your main turbines, but it should be enough to give you steerage way and forward progress. Rodriguez was examining the electrical connections with growing excitement, recognizing innovative engineering solutions that were years ahead of their time. The systems had been designed with redundancy and reliability in mind, using solid-state components that would be less susceptible to the kind of contamination that had crippled the main propulsion plant. Chief Chen was running calculations in her head, trying to determine whether the auxiliary systems could provide enough power to make a meaningful difference in their situation. The numbers were promising, suggesting that they might be able to achieve speeds of up to 15 knots, which would be sufficient to maintain steerage and make progress toward port. "Why weren't we told about these systems?" Commander Hayes asked, his voice reflecting both frustration and hope. "Our technical manuals make no mention of auxiliary propulsion capabilities." Thompson's expression grew serious as he explained the classification issues that had kept the systems secret. The technology was considered too advanced for general knowledge at the time. There were concerns about technology transfer to potential adversaries, so access was limited to a very small number of people. Unfortunately, institutional memory is poor, and knowledge of these systems was lost when key personnel retired. The process of bringing the auxiliary systems online was complex but manageable, requiring coordination between multiple departments and careful attention to safety protocols. The nuclear reactor operators had to adjust their output to provide power to systems they had never used before, while electrical technicians worked to establish connections that had been dormant for years. Captain Mitchell monitored the progress from the bridge, feeling a mixture of hope and disbelief as reports filtered up from the engineering spaces. The storm had finally begun to move away from their position, leaving calmer seas that would make their recovery efforts easier. The timing seemed almost miraculous, as if Admiral Thompson's arrival had somehow influenced even the weather. The first sign of success came when Rodriguez reported that electrical power was flowing to the auxiliary motors. The systems came online smoothly, with none of the vibration and noise associated with the main turbines. The electric drive was nearly silent, giving the Enterprise an eerie quality as it began to respond to propulsion commands for the first time in many hours. "We have steerage way," reported the helmsman, his voice filled with relief and amazement. The ship's massive rudder was once again responding to commands, allowing them to point toward their intended destination, rather than simply drifting with wind and current. The psychological effect on the crew was immediate and profound. Within an hour, the Enterprise was making steady progress at 12 knots, with the auxiliary propulsion systems performing flawlessly. The speed was modest compared to the ship's normal capabilities, but it was enough to give them control over their destiny and the ability to reach port under their own power. Chief Chen was monitoring the systems carefully, watching for any signs of stress or malfunction that might indicate problems with the untested equipment. However, the auxiliary motors were operating within normal parameters, and the electrical systems were responding beautifully to the increased load. Admiral Thompson continued to provide guidance and expertise, but his manner had become increasingly mysterious as the crisis resolved. He seemed to fade into the background as the crew took control of their ship's recovery, appearing when needed but otherwise remaining almost invisible. To most of the sailors working around him, the rescue vessels that had been racing toward the Enterprise's position received word that their assistance was no longer urgently needed, though they continued their approach to provide escort and support for the journey home. The crisis that had threatened to become a national disaster was now being managed successfully by the ship's own crew. As evening approached, Captain Mitchell found himself alone on the bridge wing, watching the sun set over calmer seas as his ship maintained steady progress toward San Diego. The events of the past 36 hours seemed almost surreal, from the initial propulsion failure to the mysterious appearance of Admiral Thompson and the discovery of systems that had saved their ship. Commander Hayes approached with the day's final reports, confirming that all systems were operating normally and that they would reach port safely within 48 hours. The crew's morale had recovered completely, and the ship was once again functioning as the powerful platform it was designed to be. "Captain, I've been looking for Admiral Thompson to thank him for his assistance," Hayes reported, "but no one seems to know where he is. Security has no record of his departure, and his assigned quarters are empty. It's as if he simply vanished." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully, having suspected that there was more to Admiral Thompson's presence than conventional explanations could account for. The Admiral had appeared when they needed him most, provided exactly the knowledge they required, and then disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. The Enterprise steamed into San Diego Harbor 2 days later under its own power, with the auxiliary propulsion systems performing flawlessly throughout the journey home. The pier was crowded with Navy officials, media representatives, and family members who had followed the crisis through news reports and official updates. Captain Mitchell stood on the bridge wing, feeling a mixture of pride and exhaustion as his ship approached its berth. The investigation into the propulsion failure had already begun, with teams of engineers and intelligence specialists working to determine how contaminated oil had found its way into the Enterprise's systems. Preliminary findings suggested deliberate sabotage by a civilian contractor, leading to arrests and a comprehensive review of fuel and lubricant supply procedures throughout the Navy. Chief Chen had become something of a celebrity within naval engineering circles, praised for her quick thinking and professional competence under extreme pressure. The auxiliary propulsion systems that Admiral Thompson had revealed were now being studied by teams of engineers who marveled at the innovative design and wondered why such capabilities had been kept secret for so long. Petty Officer Rodriguez received a commendation for his role in identifying the initial problem and his tireless work throughout the crisis. His attention to detail and willingness to report anomalies had prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure at sea. The young sailor found himself in demand, as other ships wanted to learn from his experience and improve their own monitoring procedures. Lieutenant Commander Walsh and her air traffic control team were recognized for their skill in managing the emergency diversion of Allied aircraft during the height of the crisis. The international exercise that had been interrupted by mechanical failure was rescheduled and completed successfully, with Allied commanders expressing their admiration for the professionalism displayed by the Enterprise's crew. However, the mystery of Admiral Thompson's appearance and disappearance continued to puzzle everyone involved. Official records showed no evidence of the Admiral boarding the ship, and security cameras had somehow failed to capture clear images of him despite multiple sightings by crew members. The auxiliary propulsion systems he had revealed were real and functional, but their existence was not documented in any accessible records. Captain Mitchell requested a meeting with Admiral Thompson's family, hoping to understand how the retired officer had known about the Enterprise's crisis and managed to appear aboard the ship. The meeting was arranged through Navy personnel offices, but the results only deepened the mystery surrounding the Admiral's involvement. Admiral Thompson died peacefully in his sleep 3 months ago, his daughter explained to the stunned captain. He had been in poor health for several years and rarely left his nursing home. There's no way he could have been aboard your ship during your crisis. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Navy's investigation of the incident. Multiple crew members had interacted with Admiral Thompson, received technical guidance from him, and witnessed his knowledge of systems that had saved their ship. The physical evidence of his presence was undeniable, yet official records indicated that such presence was impossible. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a Navy psychologist brought in to investigate the phenomenon, interviewed dozens of crew members who had encountered Admiral Thompson. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent, detailing a composed elderly man with extensive knowledge of the Enterprise's systems and a commanding presence that inspired confidence in crisis situations. Mass hallucination is essentially impossible under these circumstances, Dr. Martinez reported to her superiors. The crew members involved were under stress, but they were functioning professionally and making rational decisions. Their descriptions of Admiral Thompson are too detailed and consistent to dismiss as psychological phenomena. The Navy's official report on the Enterprise incident focused on the mechanical failures, the crew's response, and the improvements needed to prevent similar crises. The mystery of Admiral Thompson was noted but not explained, becoming one of those maritime mysteries that sailors would discuss for generations. Chief Chen led the effort to document and understand the auxiliary propulsion systems that had saved their ship. The technology was indeed innovative, using principles that were only now becoming standard in civilian applications. The fact that such systems had been installed and then forgotten highlighted serious problems with institutional memory and technical documentation. The contaminated oil incident led to major changes in Navy fuel and lubricant handling procedures, with new testing protocols and security measures designed to prevent sabotage. The contractor responsible for the contamination was prosecuted to the full extent of the law, but the damage to the enterprise had cost millions of dollars and nearly resulted in a major disaster. 6 months after the incident, Captain Mitchell was promoted to Rear Admiral, partly in recognition of his leadership during the crisis. The Enterprise underwent a complete overhaul of its propulsion systems, with the auxiliary electric drive motors being fully integrated into the ship's normal operations. Future crews would be trained on all available propulsion options, ensuring that critical capabilities would never again be forgotten. Petty Officer Rodriguez advanced rapidly through the ranks, his experience during the crisis marking him as someone with exceptional potential for leadership positions. He often spoke to new sailors about the importance of attention to detail and the courage required to report problems that others might prefer to ignore. The Enterprise returned to full operational status and continued its mission of projecting American naval power around the world. The ship's crew took pride in their successful handling of the crisis, knowing that they had faced the ultimate test of their professional skills and emerged victorious. But late at night, when the ship was quiet and the watch was changing, sailors would sometimes report seeing an elderly figure walking the passageways with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The sightings were never officially documented, and those who reported them were usually dismissed as victims of fatigue or imagination. Captain Mitchell, now Admiral Mitchell, never spoke publicly about Admiral Thompson's mysterious appearance during the crisis. However, he kept a photograph of the legendary officer on his desk and often found himself wondering about the thin line between the possible and the impossible when lives hang in the balance. The Enterprise sailed on, carrying with it the memory of a crisis overcome and a mystery that would never be fully explained. In the traditions of the sea, some stories are meant to inspire rather than to be understood, and the tale of Admiral Thompson's appearance during the ship's darkest hour became part of the Enterprise's proud legacy. The auxiliary propulsion systems that had saved the ship were renamed the Thompson Drive in honor of the admiral whose knowledge had revealed their existence. Future generations of naval engineers would study the innovative technology and wonder about the man who had designed systems so advanced that they were kept secret until a crisis demanded their use. The Enterprise continued its mission, stronger for having faced and overcome its greatest challenge, carrying forward the lessons learned from a crisis that had tested every aspect of its crew's courage, skill, and determination. The mystery of Admiral Thompson remained unsolved, but his legacy lived on in the ship and crew he had helped to save.